So why do I think Trump will lose this November? We've had so many news sources going on and on about how this is going to be a close race, Biden's old, drama. Look, drama sells. If they were reporting on how ugly it looks for Trump, people would assume that the race is already over and move on to something else. But drama drives engagement, which brings in ad revenue. But the evidence is mounting, and it paints an ugly picture for Trump. Nobody's talking about swing voters like they should, how the MAGA candidates are losing, how he's no longer bullying his way around, how there's no more slogans, or the effect of Roe v. Wade, or about how he keeps angering Taylor freaking Swift fans. And I think most of all, people are just sick of him. Sick of hearing about him on the news, seeing crap about him on the internet, and hearing about how he keeps escaping repercussions. And we must never discount how much people being sick of something motivates them. People get off their couches to vote in general elections for just two reasons. They vote for a candidate they want or against a candidate they hate. Even locked-in voters who always show up and always vote their party every single time are still voting for or against. Voting for their party or against the other party. This is what truly matters in presidential elections, for or against. Joe Biden won in 2020 not because people wanted to vote for him, they were voting against Trump. My opinion here is based on this formula, for or against as motivating factors. Motivation is the key part of this. We live in a nation where voting is not mandatory, and that means that people have to have a reason to actually put the effort into voting. That and decades of voter suppression have turned this into a game of motivation. Voting is like everything else that we don't particularly like to do, from taking out the trash to going to the doctor to eating healthy. It's not fun, but we should do it because what's healthy for us isn't always a good time. Whether it's going to a polling place or mailing in ballots, it's a real snore. And when people are given the opportunity to not do something that's a drag, they tend not to do it. It's why even with the highest voter turnout in modern history, only 66% of eligible voters voted in 2020. People need a reason to vote. Of course, this excludes voters who always vote and always vote for their party. I'm talking about the most important voters of all, swing voters. Now, we always hear about swing voters doing what their name suggests, swinging one way or the other. But the important part of them is that sometimes they show up and sometimes they don't. With how voters are currently split between Republicans and Democrats, swing voters are the voters who truly matter. Without going into specifics about how the Electoral College weights votes in certain states while devaluing votes in others, swing voters matter so much in important states. The more they show up, the more they really do swing an election. If you want to understand how presidential elections are won and lost, pay attention to how many swing voters show up, who they vote for or against, and most importantly, why. When you figure out why people are voting the way they are, the outcome becomes clear. It's not a foolproof way of prediction, but it can create a better picture of the situation than just stats and polls can. Now let's get into the meat of it. One of the major differences between this November's election and Trump's last victory in 2016 is that this is not the same world. So let's look back at what things were like back then and how it ended up with his victory. The world of 2016 was one of depression and stagnation for the majority of Americans. Big businesses were bailed out in the 2008 banking crash and the rest of us were left to rot. Okay, extremely long story short here. The banks were engaged in risky and fraudulent behavior. The worst ones collapsed, they couldn't pay their debts, and then those companies they owed money to couldn't pay their own debts, and so on to the point where this was a very real chance of the entire global economy could collapse. The government had to bail them out to keep the system functioning at all. The problem was that while the government was focused so hard on the mega corporations, they totally ignored the rest of us. And so people lost their jobs, their homes, their pensions, their savings. And then in the aftermath years, wages stagnated, good paying jobs went away, worker benefits vanished, and prices of goods and homes soared. And we all had to work harder for less. And then the voices of the government, news, and pundits couldn't care less about what was happening to us. Worse yet, they laughed the Occupy Wall Street movement right out of the door. They thought that our problems were a joke. This is where the avocado toast crap came from. It's them mocking us for being poor. It was as if the American dream just wasn't possible anymore, and people got depressed. Nobody wanted to admit that the party was over for us regular people, and my generation, the millennials, were drowning in student loan debt, just desperate for any job that could pay the bills. When people are drowning financially, it's hard for them to do much of anything else. This created the atmosphere by 2016 of stagnation and aimless discontent. We were a lost people. all everyone knew was a pointless struggle to keep the bills paid. While this was happening, the political world was nothing more than pundits trashing Barack Obama for petty reasons. His presidency was great for the 24-hour news corporations. The worst ones would trash him over petty things like mustard and suit color, while the rest would report on that, and then those would be the only topics of conversation. They whipped up so much hatred and vitriol for Obama that it became the primary means of increasing profits and shareholder value. This wasn't just right-wing outlets making this a thing. Outlets across the spectrum were talking about these numerous and pointless scandals. They were all talking about it like it was the hot gossip of the day, and it didn't matter if they were dispelling the scandals. The problem was that it was the only thing that they talked about. This created an environment where people really hated their president and his party, and they did the same exact thing to Hillary Clinton. They blew Benghazi so out of proportion that even people who were politically disengaged thought that it was a big deal. Look, the long story short was that the security detail at the American embassy there had holes that a terrorist group exploited. The reasonable response would have been to simply beef up security and allow for air support in dangerous locations. But that didn't matter. They used it to smear her so fully that even today I know die-hard leftists that think she's an awful, evil, corrupt woman because of it. Now, before we talk about the campaign itself, we must address the role online disinformation played in setting this scene. State-sponsored online disinformation just wasn't a real thing in our nation prior to all of this. We were not aware that there were troll farms in other nations churning out false and inflammatory information. We were not aware that online platforms were pushing right-wing narratives because they drove engagement. We didn't know. Online spaces were being flooded with inflammatory garbage all the time, and people were none the wiser. They built entire networks meant to manipulate people, and it worked. Nobody could tell what was real and what was fake, because at the time people just weren't asking that question. People didn't think that this type of operation was possible and didn't think that it could happen to us. It worked because no one knew it was happening. So, at the start of the campaign season, we had millions of people who had been economically left behind. They had years of Obama and Hillary hate being drilled into their heads, and they had multiple apparatuses of state-sponsored disinformation that was meant to get them as angry as possible. Anger is a powerful motivator, and it is natural for people to get angry about how poorly their lives are going. And they were angry, frustrated, and humiliated, and sick of all of it. And they wanted a way to express it. For a long time, Trump was that one rich guy with the funny hair from that one reality show. He would say, "You're fired," and that was pretty much what people knew of him. Yes, most of us knew his name, but not much more. He was just some celebrity and wasn't taken seriously. When he announced his run for the White House, both the news and the internet thought it was hilarious. He wasn't a real presidential candidate to all of us at the beginning. I remember people memeing and sarcastically acting like this was their guy. Nobody, absolutely nobody, thought that he was going to actually become president. It was a fun joke. But then he started to talk. He bullied his enemies, said obscene things, and was just filled with drama. He walked into Republican debates lobbing personal insults, and it worked. He secured the nomination because the rest of them were sheepish by comparison. From there was a flurry of catchphrases and trash talking. He went on tour around the nation talking about building the wall, hating on Hillary, Democrats, leftists, whoever. It didn't matter. What matters is that he was driving engagement, and he was giving the voice to the angry people, and he was pointing the way forward. And he was just so entertaining that people who didn't take politics seriously even wanted to vote for him. He was just full of motivating factors back then. Even his catchphrases were motivating. Whether it was build the wall, or crooked Hillary, or drain the swamp, it worked. When you have a nation that is chock full of people who don't really know what is going on in the political landscape, catchphrases work. They gave people something to latch on to, something that stuck with them, something that they could repeat and feel good about. And then there was Hillary Clinton's campaign. Were there even catchphrases? Was there marketing? What was her message? I ask because nobody remembers any of it. We got the sense that it was a done deal from the get-go. She was going to become the next president, full stop. I suspect that herself and her campaign staff also thought this was true. They ran it like a typical election and didn't do anything to galvanize the voters. And this was all happening while Trump was going on and on about her emails and calling her crooked and all that. The narrative of the 2016 campaign was that she was a corrupt criminal and he was the man who was going to fix things. The narrative gave people reasons to vote against Hillary and for Trump. And then in November, Trump barely won. Let's not sugarcoat this. It was an extremely narrow victory. A few thousand votes in key swing states won it for him. And if we were going by pure total numbers of votes, he would have lost. She won the popular vote by 3 million. 2016 was such a strange time. We did not know Trump at all at that point. He said a lot of incendiary things that no other politician would. Social media played a critical role for arguably the first time. Clinton was unpopular. The majority of us were still reeling from the 2008 crash, and he was not taken seriously. And now, none of those things are true anymore. And so we move on to the 2020 election. It was a different environment, and it was nowhere near as complicated as 2016 was. We were just past the worst of COVID. We had 4 long years of a disastrous presidency, and so many things went wrong for him. Trump was not the same man as he was in 2016. Gone were the days of slogans and bullying. Social media had surprisingly had a tighter grip on misinformation, and swing voters had enough time to see what kind of president he was. And so, they voted him out. They didn't vote for Joe Biden, they voted against Trump. And I suspect that the reason why the DNC gave Biden the nomination was because he was so plain that it was really hard for Trump to smear him. He was such a safe bet. A former vice president who had no real scandals, didn't really say anything at all, and was kind of just there during the last Democratic presidency. Safe pick. They let people simply vote against Trump, and it worked. It worked so well that Biden had 7 million more votes than him. And I suspect that people were even taking out their COVID anger on Trump. I think that was the deciding factor in the election. He handled the pandemic poorly, and the pandemic caused so many problems for people that they showed up in numbers to fire him. And so finally, we arrive to the world of today. That is early May 2024. I think that the deciding factor in this upcoming election is that swing voters are simply sick of him. He and his MAGA politicians have not truly won an election since 2016, and in the 2018 midterms, Democrats made substantial gains. Republicans lost across the board in 2020, and then in 2022, that famous red wave was more of a bit of a splash. It's absolutely common for a president to lose control of the House and/or Senate 2 years into their presidency, but this time around, Republicans barely took control of the House. And even now, with all the turmoil taking place in the Republican side of the aisle, they may very well lose their majority by November as well. Swing voters have been showing up since 2018, and they never really do at these kind of numbers. They've already shown us that they do not like him with all of these losses. How is that going to change from now until November? This is Trump's election to lose. Now, how could he change the narrative to get people to vote either for him or against Biden? We are in the aftermath period of a disaster. In these times, people are looking for stability and reinvestment. We're picking up the pieces. We don't need bullies or anger or discourse. We need stability. And Donald Trump just isn't that. And worse yet, he's the person most associated with the calamities from the second half of the 20-teens, and especially COVID. And let's not forget that he led an angry mob to the Capitol in order to violently overthrow the election in 2020. He was the point of it all. That was his disaster. Whether he is guilty of sending those people up there or not, he is why it happened. And if people don't want to see more violence or fake electors, voting against him is how they do that. So why would people want to vote for him now? He's got to do something between now and November to get people to bring him back. Whether it's through rebooting his fiery rhetoric, or getting back to yelling about Mexicans and leftists, or capitalizing on scandals, he needs something to get people to vote for him. And what is he doing right now? He's sitting in a courtroom being reported on in not so great terms. All we hear about him is him sleeping in court and whining about being persecuted on a social media platform that nobody uses. We can't discount how critical these court cases are. They're taking up all the air in the room when it comes to Trump. No candidate has ever looked good while campaigning from a courtroom. It's hard to get people to vote for you when you're in trouble, and worse yet, he is not on the campaign trail giving fiery speeches. That matters. He isn't controlling the narrative, he isn't attacking the people his supporters hate, he isn't coming up with his style of inspirational slogans, he isn't doing anything but whining about his cases. Does anybody like a whiner? Seriously. Has anyone ever voted for someone because they complained about and moaned about something? It's never a good look. From what I've seen of these cases, it's only going to get worse for him before the election. And now there are just so many reasons for people to vote against him. From his disastrous presidency to the very fine people on both sides to the pandemic, to his lawsuits, to him not galvanizing the voters, to the repeal of Roe v. Wade, to the fact that we are in a recovery period. And all these reasons culminate with the fact that people are just sick of him. Trump is a thing of the past, and a painful one at that. I have to speak about Roe v. Wade now. The Supreme Court took something that they claimed they weren't going to change and then did it anyways. And Trump installed 3 of the 9 justices, all of whom said that they consider Roe to be a settled matter. That's on Trump in the eyes of the populace. They reversed a ruling that has real consequences for millions of people. And the thing about politics is that you never want to take things away from people who vote for you. We live in a nation where there has been a sort of implicit agreement that the government doesn't do anything that negatively affects us in tangible ways. Like, say if they were to ban alcohol nationwide, it would result in a lot of politicians losing their jobs. The repeal of Roe is kind of like that. The Republicans took away an emergency option for people and gave them potentially disastrous results. They made people fear unwanted and dangerous pregnancies. This is real stuff right here. It's life-changing and not for the better. How do you campaign on, we're going to make your life harder? How do you get people to vote for you doing that? Plus, as much as people don't like to admit, pro-choice has been flatly popular for a long time. It's why Republican politicians have shied away from it being an issue that they campaign on. Even Trump doesn't like to go near it. He doesn't want it to be an issue, and that's why he's never really talked about it. But people will vote against him because they think this is his fault. He is a place to direct their anger towards. Now, what about voting against Biden? Well, the most motivating thing to vote against him is that inflation has sucked for a while. Things have gotten more expensive, and it seems like he really isn't doing much about it. It's a tangible issue that has real consequences for everyone. It's something that sucks, but isn't a totally Biden issue. People complain about inflation, but how often do they really link him to him? Aside from the MAGAs trying to desperately pin it on him, Biden is not involved in any scandals making inflation worse. He hasn't been caught making it worse, and this isn't his issue. Not like insurrections, poorly handled pandemics, and a whole bunch of drama. This election is not about Joe freaking Biden. It's about Trump. He is the candidate that people emotionally focus on. And so much of these emotions are ones that motivate people to vote against him. And there are just so many things that make people sick of him. I think that he doesn't currently have a win condition because the primary motivating factor is that people are voting against him. Meanwhile, the reasons for voting against Biden just aren't there, and the reasons for voting for Trump just also aren't there. And now, at last, the only real question we should be asking ourselves as of May 2024, are people angry enough and sick enough of Donald Trump to vote against him? I think that's where the election is going to be decided. And to me, there's just so many bad things going for him. So many people sick and tired of him and in hearing about him and dealing with him and just the noise coming from him. And I don't see anything that really shows that he's going to get the swing voters on his side. And I think he's going to lose for it.